Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why consistent work trumps hard work or working at your absolute maximum threshold for your gains over a longer period of time or for the long term. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this because this is something a lot of people who are newer to training miss out on because they go see different people who maybe put up there on YouTube videos or these serious athletes or serious bodybuilders or other people who are doing their hardest, most brutal training sessions. And that's what you see put up online. Without keeping in mind a lot of these guys are using a lot of drugs to increase aggression, increase work capacity, improve recovery, things like that. And the reality is, when we're talking about gains, we're talking about long-term gains. In other words, muscle building is a slow process, and it might seem like it comes fairly quick early on when you're new to training because of the new gains, but what you're going to find real quickly is that you could reach a threshold of training eventually to where what you gain in 1 year, even on a perfect training program, can sometimes be less than you were gaining in a month when you were a noob. And that's going to be something that can be a little depressing for people when they start training, when they come to that realization. But that is the reality. Building muscle is a long, slow process. It really is. It is a long-term process. And again, it is about the long game, not the short game. And the truth of the matter is, I'm not saying hard work isn't important, and I'm not saying pushing yourself and challenging yourself and disrupting homeostasis in your body isn't important, because it is. But what you need to understand is training is a cumulative effect over time. In other words, what you do in any one single training session probably isn't going to matter a month from now, or 6 weeks from now, or 3 months from now. It's not really going to matter because it is about that continual stimulation, that continual adaptation. And what ends up happening is that a lot of people, when they come in and they start training, going all out, they start doing all this, what they call high intensity methods and things, to where they're training to failure on every set. Doing forced reps, doing cheat reps, doing triple drop sets, right? Supersetting everything. They come in and they do all this stuff and they push themselves to the limit. And before long, what happens? You start seeing all these kids, they need a pre-workout now to get through this because they're trying to train like this. And then all of a sudden now they need to put stimulants in their body because they can't train that way. They start getting fatigued. They need something for motivation. They got to blast their music. They have to have really loud, aggressive music. They have to have stimulants. They have to have all this stuff to maintain the intensity of their training without realizing that maybe there's a reason it's difficult to maintain that intensity, maybe because it's not really what you should be doing all the time. And what ends up happening before long, people get burned out, injuries accumulate, but mainly that burnout, because it reaches a threshold to where when you're pushing yourself so hard, and you have so much adrenaline going with your training, to where you start to burn out. You start to burn out and you get tired of it. You don't want to do it as much, and your consistency starts dropping off. And that's one of the reasons you see people who do all the body part splits, right? Because they're just too fatigued to come in and do squat again. They're too fatigued to do lower body or back or whatever again every time they train. So before long, they're like, I'll just hit each of these once a week. Well, then, if you're not using drugs to maintain elevated muscle protein synthesis, when you're hitting each muscle group once a week, everybody out there, you guys saw me do videos with Sean talking about it, Matt Ogus talking about it, Athlean X talking about it. Training a muscle group once a week is not ideal, and all the scientific literature shows that. It only really works well when you're using pretty copious amounts of drugs. It is a slower way to gain otherwise, and that's exactly what happens. People start dropping off with some of this, and they go into training methods like that because they're just too fatigued to train their legs, their back, or any of those muscle groups, those big muscles, 2-3 times a week. Because of the way that they're training. So then consistency drops off. And the reality is, you guys want to know what the truth is? As far as the research we've seen over the decades on hypertrophy, training at 90% versus 100% doesn't produce different results. In other words, when you come in and you train with 90% effort, in every single study that I'm aware of that's compared that, like 90% perceived effort versus going all out, you gain the same muscle and same amount of strength. There's no reason to actually push it to the limits all the time. I'm not saying you can't do it on one-offs, but we're talking about consistent work. Consistent work trumps hard work. Where you come in and a session is just a training session, And yeah, it can be a little boring sometimes. It can be monotonous. But you know what? Like with anything else in life, it just becomes part of your lifestyle. But what you find when you start coming in and start pushing yourself to 80, 90%, you can do all these things more consistently. Well, what do we know about the muscle protein synthesis? It only lasts about 48 hours after you train a muscle group. And so we're basically balancing recovery time with muscle protein synthesis uptime and frequency all the time. And so what you start finding is that just being consistent and consistently putting in the work actually produces a lot more growth in the long term. I'm not talking about, hey, what can I do in a month? And yeah, if you push yourself to the absolute limits versus keeping some in the tank, especially in your first year of training, you might gain a little more muscle that month as a result of it. But if you end up being burned out and fatigued and you train like crap and you start slipping off after 3 months, you end up gaining less for the entire year. And what you ultimately find is that the people who get the best results are the ones who are consistent. They come in and they hit their big lifts and the big muscles and hit everything about as frequently as they can recover from it, which is for most people going to be 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, I'm going to be honest here. Like if you honestly think that you train hard, but you don't hit your squats and your pull-ups or rows and things like that 2 or 3 times every week, yeah, those lifts, you really aren't training that hard. You're certainly not training that consistent. Because yeah, it might seem like a lot of work to do a bunch in one day, but you know, can you come back and squat again in a couple days? 2-3 days later, can you do it again? Again, that's a problem if you can't. You're not being consistent. And we know that high frequency and consistency is what gets results. And at the end of the day, even if you're using a method that's not ideal, let's say your training frequency isn't ideal, maybe it's not. Maybe you're only squatting once every 4 days, once every 5 days. Maybe you're only doing rows once every 4 days. Okay, fine. But are you doing it consistently for 3 years straight? The person who comes in and over 2, 3, 4 years, 5 years, comes in and consistently trains all their big exercises, their important lifts, the stuff that matters the most, at a pretty decent frequency, and they come in and they consistently hit their target goals. In other words, it's not about can I squeeze out 3 more reps. It's, hey, my goal today is to come in and squat 3 sets of 5 with 320 pounds, right? And then later next week, I want to try to do that, with 322 and a half within 2 weeks or whatever their goal is, right? And they come in and they consistently hit those target numbers. I want to bench press, 245 for 3 sets of 8. That's my target goal going in today. And it's not about can I squeeze out 1 more rep. No, that's your target number. That's what you're shooting for. The people who come in and just consistently train and progress and reach their target numbers day after day, month after month, year after year, those people reach a lot more muscle mass. Those people get a lot bigger and a lot stronger, and they usually do it with less injuries than the guys who are coming in and just pushing it and trying to go 100% all the time and all the triple drop sets and the forced reps, and who they have to blast Slayer to train, and they have to have a pre-workout and 600 milligrams of caffeine and all this stuff to make it through their training. Whereas in the guy who just comes in and consistently just puts in the work, reaches his target numbers, hits his goals, does them, goes home, recovers, and comes back 2 days later and does it again, that guy is going to make more progress. He's going to make more progress. He's not going to get the same burnout. Now, some people would argue, well, that would get boring. Well, training isn't always fun, and that's what people need to understand when it comes to training. If you're training should be enjoyable to some extent. But a lot of it comes down to you have to learn to enjoy training rather than trying to make your training enjoyable. Because again, that's the sort of stuff personal trainers have to do to motivate really lazy people who can't self-start. You don't want to be that person. If you're serious about your goals or your health or your fitness or your sport or whatever you're trying to do, you have to learn to program your mind to enjoy your training. Even if it starts to get boring, even if it starts to get a little monotonous, even if it gets a little bit stale, learning to enjoy it and understanding that sometimes, even though we should learn to enjoy it, sometimes it's not always going to be fun. Sometimes it is work. Sometimes it is just something that you know that you have to do to reach your goals. Sometimes it can be as monotonous as something you don't like at your job. But the question you've got to ask yourself is, why do you have a job? Because you want the money or the end result of it. You do it for a reason. And training is the same way. And if you approach your training as purely you're doing it and trying to find the most fun and entertaining way to train, you're going to really struggle. You're going to struggle with consistency in the long term, because you're going to end up having to change stuff too often to keep it entertaining, and that random changing of stuff doesn't work very well, again, unless you're using enough drugs that the muscle confusion principle seems to work. It's just because you added another 500 milligrams of test every week. The muscle confusion didn't work. The drugs worked. All right, you got to watch these goofy ass bodybuilders and the stuff they come up with. But that's a perfect example of it. You're going to struggle with your consistency if that's the case. So at the end of the day, I'm not saying hard work doesn't matter, but consistent, moderately hard work will produce dramatically better results than coming in and just killing it every single session. It absolutely will. And you're going to end up being a hell of a lot more consistent, because that consistency is what gives results, not pushing that bleeding edge all the time. It is the consistency that gets you there over the years when we're talking about the long term. When you're trying to reach, a 3-year goal, a 5-year goal, things like that. Your consistency is everything. It is everything. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.